The Arabian Sea at depth is a different world from the one that exists at its surface. Below the thermocline, the boundary layer where warm surface water meets the colder, denser water beneath it, the acoustic environment changes completely. Sound that would dissipate quickly near the surface travels differently at depth, bending and channeling through the water column in ways that passive sonar operators spend careers learning to read. The thermocline is both a shield and a trap. It conceals a submerged vessel from surface sensors looking down through it, and it reflects acoustic energy back toward the depths in a way that makes a submarine running below it acoustically invisible to sensors positioned above it. The Iranian Navy's Kilo-class submarine had been exploiting this boundary layer for 11 days. It had been running slow, deep, and quiet in the convergence zone southeast of the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States Navy had been looking for it for all 11 of those days. The USS guided missile destroyer had been assigned as the lead surface asset in the anti-submarine warfare search pattern organized by 5th Fleet after the Kilo departed its berth at Bandar Abbas on what Iranian state media characterized in a one-paragraph announcement released 48 hours after the departure as a routine extended training patrol. 5th Fleet's assessment of the patrol's purpose was more specific. The timing, 3 days after the conclusion of a U.S.-led maritime exercise that had included anti-submarine warfare components practiced in the same general operating area, suggested that the Kilo's mission was at least partially oriented toward collection. Studying the acoustic signatures of U.S. Navy surface and submarine assets that had been operating in the area during the exercise, mapping the thermocline characteristics of the operating area at depth, and demonstrating to the U.S. Navy's own surveillance architecture that Iran could deploy a capable diesel-electric submarine into the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz and operate it for extended periods without being confidently localized. It was this last element, the demonstration, that the intelligence picture, assembled from 11 days of acoustic collection, satellite imagery of Iranian naval base activity, and the specific emissions data gathered by the destroyer's own electronic warfare suite, suggested had been the primary purpose of the patrol all along. The Kilo was not simply hiding. It was being conspicuously quiet in a way that forced the U.S. Navy to devote significant assets to the search, and the devotion of those assets was itself the product the Iranian Navy was generating. Every P-8 sortie, every sonobuoy barrier, every course adjustment by U.S. surface combatants to optimize their towed array geometry, all of it was costing something, consuming time and maintenance cycles and aircrew rest periods, and all of it was happening in response to a submarine that had, as of 3:30 a.m. on the morning the surface picture changed, not been confidently classified in 11 days of sustained search effort. At 3:31 a.m., the towed array registered a narrowband tonal contact at bearing 214 degrees. The contact was faint, barely distinguishable from the ambient noise floor of the deep Arabian Sea at that hour, but it was present on 3 consecutive 5-minute spectral frames in a way that the watch operator recognized as something different from the biological and mechanical sources that populated the background picture. A narrowband tonal at a specific frequency is not a biologics contact. It is not wave action. It is a rotating machine operating at a fixed speed, and the specific frequency of the tonal, cross-referenced against the acoustic classification library that the destroyer's sonar system carried in its database, produced a tentative classification within 18 minutes of the initial detection. Possible Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine, submerged bearing 214 degrees, range uncertain but estimated between 8 and 22 nautical miles, based on signal amplitude analysis. The commanding officer was in the Combat Information Center by 3:52 a.m. He reviewed the spectral data with the anti-submarine warfare coordinator, who walked him through the classification logic in the methodical sequence of a professional presenting evidence rather than a conclusion. The tonal was present. Its frequency was within the classification window for the Kilo's propulsion plant harmonic signature. It had been present on 3 consecutive frames with consistent bearing and consistent frequency, which eliminated most of the transient sources that produce false contacts at this confidence level. The classification was tentative. The commanding officer accepted the tentative classification and directed the watch team to proceed on that basis. The P-8 Poseidon assigned to the night search pattern was 140 nautical miles northwest when the contact was reported. The aircraft crew received the contact data at 3:54 a.m. and was already turning southeast at 3:55 a.m., adjusting their routing to arrive overhead the estimated contact position within 34 minutes. The commanding officer directed the destroyer to reduce speed from its standard search transit of 12 knots to 8 knots, minimizing its own self-noise contribution to the acoustic picture and allowing the towed array to achieve the best possible resolution on the contact bearing while the P-8 closed the distance. At 4:09 a.m., the tonal contact strengthened, not dramatically. A 3 decibel increase in the signal level that the watch operator noted in the contact log with the precision of someone who understands that in acoustic contact development, 3 decibels is a significant change rather than a marginal one. The strengthening was consistent with the contact closing the range toward the destroyer's position. A submarine moving toward the source of tonal contact in a detection scenario is not necessarily approaching intentionally. It may simply be maintaining a course that happens to reduce the separation distance. But in the context of 11 days of deliberate concealment, followed by a contact that was strengthening as the destroyer reduced speed, the strengthening carried a weight that the commanding officer noted without immediately acting on. At 4:17 a.m., the contact changed. The towed array registered a new acoustic signature on the same bearing, not a tonal, but a broadband transient whose characteristics the classification system processed and returned a result for within 6 seconds. The result was unambiguous: ballast tank blow. The specific acoustic signature of high-pressure air being forced into a submarine's ballast tanks to reduce its overall density and initiate a positive buoyancy ascent. The Kilo was coming up. The commanding officer had 18 seconds between the ballast blow detection and the moment the Kilo's sail broke the surface at bearing 216 degrees, range 6.1 nautical miles. The sail appeared on the destroyer's surface search radar first, a small, low contact that resolved into a definite surface return within 4 seconds of its appearance above the waterline, its position consistent with the bearing that the towed array had been tracking for the previous 46 minutes. Then, the hull began to emerge, the forward deck appearing above the surface as the submarine completed its ascent and stabilized its surface trim in the dark, flat water of the pre-dawn Arabian Sea. 6.1 nautical miles. The Kilo-class submarine had surfaced at 6.1 nautical miles from a U.S. Navy guided missile destroyer that it had almost certainly been tracking on its own passive sonar for at least as long as the destroyer had been tracking it. The surfacing was not an accident. It was not a mechanical emergency requiring a rapid ascent. A submarine that needs to surface in an emergency does not conduct a controlled ballast blow at a precise bearing from a surface contact it has been monitoring. It surfaces as quickly as the physics allow and begins transmitting on distress frequencies. The Kilo did neither. It surfaced in a controlled, deliberate ascent at a range of 6.1 nautical miles from the only U.S. Navy surface combatant in its immediate operating area, in the dark, without transmitting on any radio frequency, without activating any navigational lights, and without making any communication of any kind. It simply appeared on the surface, present, visible to radar, aware that it was visible to radar, and waiting. The commanding officer had the picture with the clarity of someone who had been thinking about this specific scenario for 11 days and had considered, during that time, what it meant if the submarine's emergence from concealment was itself the message rather than the prelude to one. A submarine that has been hiding successfully and chooses to surface in front of the vessel that has been searching for it is not a vessel that has been caught. It is a vessel that has decided to be seen at a moment of its own choosing, at a range it selected, in a posture it controlled. The Kilo hadn't been found. It had presented itself. And the distinction between those two outcomes carried the entire weight of what the next several hours would determine. At 4:18 a.m., the commanding officer directed the electronic warfare officer to document every emission from the surfaced contact. He directed the tactical action officer to bring all weapon systems to active standby. He directed the navigation team to establish a track on the surface contact and maintain it continuously. And he directed the communications officer to transmit on Channel 16 and on the international safety frequencies in Farsi and English, identifying the destroyer and requesting the unidentified surfaced vessel to identify itself and state its intentions. No response came from the Kilo on any frequency. The submarine sat on the surface at 6.1 nautical miles and said nothing. At 4:22 a.m., the P-8 arrived overhead at 4,000 feet and established a surveillance orbit above the Kilo's position. The aircraft's surface search radar had the submarine in track before it reached the area, and the crew's visual sensors, FLIR and optical, now provided the flag spaces with a continuous video feed of the submarine's hull as it rode at surface trim in the dark water below. The feed showed a vessel in normal surface trim, no visible damage, no crew on deck, no lights of any kind. A submarine resting on the surface in the dark, being watched by a maritime patrol aircraft from 4,000 feet and a destroyer from 6.1 nautical miles, making no response to either. The Kilo's commanding officer understood this geometry completely. He had surfaced at a range and in a posture that was simultaneously non-threatening. No weapon systems active, no aggressive maneuver, no approach toward the destroyer, and unmistakably provocative, because a surfaced Iranian submarine in the Arabian Sea at 4:18 a.m., having spent 11 days successfully concealing its position from the U.S. Navy, was not a vessel making an innocent transit. It was a vessel delivering a message in the most controlled, deniable form available. I was here. I found you before you found me. I am showing you this now because I chose to, not because I had to. The commanding officer composed his message in the same language. At 4:24 a.m., the destroyer altered course toward the Kilo and increased speed to 18 knots. Not an intercept speed, 18 knots toward a surface contact at 6.1 nautical miles represented a closing timeline of approximately 20 minutes, which was deliberate. 20 minutes was enough time for the Kilo's commanding officer to assess what was happening, to communicate with Bandar Abbas if his communications architecture supported it, and to make a decision about what to do next. The destroyer was not rushing. It was moving with the specific, measured pace of a vessel that has decided the conversation requires a shorter distance between the participants. The Kilo did not move. At 4:28 a.m., the Seahawk helicopter received new tasking. The crew descended from their standard patrol altitude to 200 feet and established an orbit directly overhead the Kilo's hull, the rotor wash disturbing the flat surface of the water around the submarine in a circle that would have been visible from the submarine's bridge if anyone had been standing on it in the dark. The helicopter's FLIR locked onto the submarine's hull with a thermal acquisition that revealed the specific heat signature of its diesel exhaust vents. The Kilo was running its snorkel system at reduced power, maintaining battery charge while on the surface rather than fully shutting down its propulsion systems. A submarine that keeps its propulsion plant in a ready-to-dive configuration while on the surface has not committed to remaining on the surface. It is maintaining the option to submerge quickly. The Seahawk crew activated the laser designator at 4:29 a.m., locking onto the Kilo's sail structure. The beam was invisible in the darkness above the Arabian Sea. To the submarine's own electro-optical defense systems, systems that every Kilo-class vessel carries specifically to detect laser designator activations, it registered as a targeting solution maintained from directly overhead by a platform it could not engage without surfacing additional crew and manually deploying weapon systems that had not been prepared for use. The message in the laser was the same message it always carried. Someone has solved for your position and is holding that solution ready. The variable between the solution and its application is a command decision. The Kilo submerged at 4:31 a.m. Not a crash dive, a controlled descent, the ballast tanks flooding in the deliberate sequence of a crew executing a planned dive rather than an emergency one. The sail disappeared below the surface within 45 seconds of the dive initiation. The surface search radar lost contact with the hull within 90 seconds. The P-8's FLIR tracked the thermal disturbance of the dive, the turbulence at the surface, the brief acoustic signature of the ballast flood, and then the Arabian Sea was flat and dark again, and the Kilo was gone. But it was not gone in the way it had been gone for the previous 11 days. The towed array had the submarine in tentative contact within 4 minutes of the dive, a contact that was closer, stronger, and more confidently classified than anything the 11-day search had produced, because the Kilo had surfaced at 6.1 nautical miles, and the destroyer had closed to 4.3 nautical miles during the surface interaction, and at 4.3 nautical miles, with a fresh post-dive acoustic signature to work from, the classification picture was incomparably better than it had been at any previous point in the search. The commanding officer had his prey back on the acoustic picture and had it at a range and with a classification confidence that changed the character of the engagement entirely. He directed the destroyer to slow to 6 knots, optimizing the towed array's performance, and directed the P-8 crew to deploy a sonobuoy barrier pattern around the Kilo's last known position to fence in its immediate maneuvering options, while the towed array continued developing the contact. At 4:44 a.m., the sonobuoy pattern was complete. 9 buoys in a barrier geometry that covered the Kilo's most probable operating area, based on its speed and heading at the time of dive. 7 of the 9 buoys reported acoustic contact consistent with the previous tonal classification. The Kilo was inside the barrier. Its position was now constrained not just by the towed array's bearing line, but by the intersection of multiple sonobuoy contact bearings that resolved its position to within approximately 1.1 nautical miles. The submarine changed course at 4:51 a.m. The sonobuoy contacts recorded the change simultaneously across 3 sensors, a bearing shift that indicated the Kilo had turned and was attempting to exit the barrier on its northeastern boundary, moving away from the destroyer's position and toward deeper water. The course change was tracked in real time by the sonobuoy network and reported to the commanding officer as a bearing and an estimated speed, 8 knots on a heading of approximately 048 degrees. The P-8 repositioned 2 sonobuoys to reinforce the northeastern boundary of the barrier at 4:53 a.m. The reposition closed the gap the Kilo was moving toward before the submarine reached it. The new buoys established contact within 3 minutes of deployment. The Kilo was still inside the barrier. At 5:04 a.m., the contact slowed. From 8 knots to 4 knots over a 4-minute period, the deceleration visible in the changing bearing rates across the sonobuoy network as the submarine reduced its transit speed. A submarine that reduces speed inside a sonobuoy barrier is not a vessel that believes it is undetected. It is a vessel whose commanding officer has assessed the acoustic picture around him, has recognized that multiple contacts from multiple bearings are inconsistent with background noise, and has made a decision to reduce his own acoustic output while he determines what his options are. The Kilo's commanding officer knew he was being tracked. The slowdown was the acknowledgement. At 5:11 a.m., the towed array registered the second ballast blow of the engagement. The Kilo surfaced again at 5:12 a.m. Range 3.8 nautical miles from the destroyer. In the pre-dawn gray that was beginning to develop on the eastern horizon, the submarine's sail was visible from the destroyer's bridge with aided optics before the radar return had fully resolved. At 3.8 nautical miles, in growing light, the Kilo sat on the surface and the destroyer sat 3.8 nautical miles away. And for 22 minutes, neither vessel moved significantly, neither vessel transmitted on any radio frequency, and neither vessel made any action that a third-party observer would have characterized as hostile under any applicable framework. But neither vessel was doing nothing. The destroyer's sensors were recording every detail of the Kilo's surface configuration, hull condition, antenna positions, any visible crew activity, any change in the trim of the vessel that would indicate ballast adjustment. The P-8 overhead was doing the same from 4,000 feet. And below the surface, around the Kilo's hull, the sonobuoy network was maintaining its position fix on a submarine that had now surfaced twice within 2 hours in front of a U.S. Navy destroyer, establishing a behavioral pattern that would be analyzed and documented long after both vessels had departed the area. At 5:34 a.m., the Kilo began transmitting, not on a distress frequency, not on a maritime safety channel, on a frequency associated with the IRGC Navy's standard surface-to-shore communications link, transmitting an encrypted message toward the Iranian coastline. The electronic warfare officer logged the transmission, collected the frequency, power level, and duration data with timestamp accuracy, and transmitted the collection to Fifth Fleet's intelligence team immediately. The content of the message was encrypted and not immediately readable. Its existence was itself a data point. The Kilo was reporting to Bandar Abbas. What it was reporting, its position, the status of the U.S. vessels around it, an assessment of the situation, was not decodable from the collection data alone, but the fact that it was reporting at this moment after 2 surface events in 2 hours told the commanding officer something about where the decision authority for the submarine's next action resided. At 5:41 a.m., the Kilo dived for the second time. Again controlled. Again deliberate. Again without any communication to the destroyer or to the P-8 above. The towed array lost contact within 7 minutes of the dive. The sonobuoy network lost contact within 11 minutes. The contact that the acoustic picture had provided for the previous 93 minutes, a contact better than anything the previous 11 days had produced, faded back into the ambient noise of the Arabian Sea as the Kilo put distance and water column between itself and the sensors surrounding it. At 6:08 a.m., the P-8 detected a weak tonal on one of the inner sonobuoys at a bearing that placed the Kilo 14 nautical miles southwest and moving away from the operating area. The contact was tentative. The commanding officer logged it as probably the Kilo and documented the bearing and estimated heading in the operational record. By 6:30 a.m., even the tentative contact had faded. The submarine was gone in the operational sense, back below the thermocline, back in the acoustic environment that had concealed it for 11 days, with the added advantage of having now studied the U.S. Navy's sonobuoy deployment patterns, towed array response times, and P-8 barrier geometry from a position of direct experience rather than theoretical assessment. The engagement report transmitted to Fifth Fleet at 8:15 a.m. was specific, detailed, and precise in its language. Because its audience would include intelligence analysts, submarine warfare specialists, and operational commanders who needed the data it contained for purposes extending well beyond the tactical outcome of the preceding 4 hours. The report documented 2 surface events, the acoustic contact timeline, the sonobuoy barrier performance, the Kilo's course changes, and speed reductions inside the barrier, the 2 ballast blow signatures with their timing and acoustic characteristics, and the single encrypted transmission at 5:34 a.m. with its frequency and duration data. The cost section documented real material consumption, 11 P-8 flight hours across the night sortie and the contact development period, 23 sonobuoys deployed across 2 barrier patterns, the Seahawk crew airborne for 4 hours and 41 minutes, the towed array requiring a calibration verification cycle after the intensive contact period, no weapons expended, no material damage, no personnel casualties. The strategic cost assessment was more complex and was not reducible to a maintenance form. The Kilo had demonstrated that it could operate in the Arabian Sea approaches for 11 days without being confidently detected by a U.S. RAV Navy surface and air search effort. It had then surfaced at a moment of its own choosing, at a range it selected, in a posture that allowed it to communicate its presence and its situational awareness to the searching destroyer without committing any action that would constitute a hostile act under applicable rules. It had dived when the geometry became unfavorable, resurfaced when it had made its assessment and completed its communication to Bandar Abbas, and dived again without having been forced to do either by anything the U.S. Navy had done. The entire sequence had been conducted on the Kilo's timeline, under the Kilo's command authority, in the Kilo's operational interests. What the U.S. Navy had produced in return was an acoustic intelligence product, a sonobuoy barrier performance record, a close-range optical and electronic intelligence collection on the Kilo's surface configuration, and a documented behavioral pattern. 2 surfaces in 93 minutes, the specific conditions under which each surface occurred, the encrypted transmission to Bandar Abbas that would inform the threat picture for Iranian submarine operations in this theater for the following 6 to 12 months. Neither side had fired. Neither side had transmitted any public statement. The Arabian Sea was flat and dark and empty of anything that a satellite could resolve as an event. But the record existed, and the record showed what the previous 4 hours had contained and what each side had taken from it. The Kilo had found the destroyer before the destroyer found the Kilo. That was the 11-day product of diesel-electric patience below the thermocline. What it had not found was a crew that flinched. It found instead a vessel that closed to 4.3 nautical miles, deployed a barrier that held it inside a 1.1-mile position fixed for 40 minutes, tracked every course change in real time, and collected its Bandar Abbas transmission with a precision the Kilo's commanding officer could not have missed on his own sensors. 2 surfaces. 1 encrypted transmission. 11 days of concealment, followed by 93 minutes of documented presence. 1 sonobuoy barrier that held a Kilo inside a 1.1 nautical mile position. Fix. 0 weapons fired. 0 course deviations by the destroyer from its assigned search pattern. The Arabian Sea remembers the vessels that move through it by the acoustic signatures they leave in the water column and the records they generate in the systems that track them. The Kilo left a signature that the U.S. Navy now knows. The destroyer left a record that the Iranian Navy now has. Both sides go forward with more data than they had before. That is the arithmetic of gray zone submarine operations. Neither side wins it cleanly. Both sides learn from it. And the vessel that learns most efficiently from what the water provides is the one that will hold the deeper advantage in the next iteration of the same argument. The search continues. The thermocline is still there. And somewhere beneath it, in the converging acoustic channels of the deep Arabian Sea, the next patrol is already running quiet.